Hi friends, hello, welcome to Books and Crafts. My name is Martyna, and in today's video I'm going to be doing the exciting Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. I was very kindly tagged by the lovely Ellie from the channel BBD Bobbidi Books, which is such a cute name, and I will of course link her down below. Please check out her channel. She is so well spoken and such a sweet person. I really like watching her videos. So thank you so much for tagging me, Ellie. And this tag is 10 questions all about what is your story of reading fantasy, how did you start, why do you love it. And I think because I've just had this booktube channel for a little over a month, I think this is still a good way for me to introduce myself to you, as fantasy is my most read and my favorite genre. So without further ado, let's start with the questions. And question number 1 is, what is your fantasy origin story? What kind of books got you into fantasy? So I believe the very first fantasy book that I have ever read was the Harry Potter series, and actually, funnily enough, this was a required reading at my primary school, like 6th grade or something like that. So we all read it, I fell in love with it, and as I was growing up and the books were coming out, I was kind of growing up with Harry and his friends, and I was dreaming about getting my own letter to Hogwarts. I fell in love with the magical school setting, with wizards, with pretty much this whole world. So this means a lot to me. I don't support the author anymore, but this story does have a special place in my heart because it introduced me to fantasy. And another book that kind of introduced me to this more high fantasy and classical fantasy was The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. And again, this was a required reading in my, I believe, middle school maybe, or again primary school. I don't think it's like that anymore in Poland. I think the curriculum changed a lot. I fell in love with The Hobbit. I remember, well, I haven't reread it in years, but I remember loving the humor in it and the whole world and the hobbits and the dwarves and the elves. There was so much that I was new to, and so much that this book introduced me to, and I really would like to reread both this and the original trilogy as well. Question number 2. If you could be a hero in a story, who would be the author and what trope would you insist on? I thought a lot about this question, and I think I finally settled on Juliet Marillier, who is the author of Daughter of the Forest, which I just recently read. I chose her because, first of all, I believe that she would give me a really beautiful setting. The setting in this book is this magical forest, and the way she described it, I felt like I was there. I also think that she would write me as a strong and resilient character, which is the way she wrote Sorka in this book. And I believe she would also weave in some magical elements, not too many, but some, to just create this folklore-inspired setting for my story, which I absolutely would love to be in. And the tropes that I would insist that she writes for me are, first, I'm going to steal an answer from Ellie, and I'm going to say magical school, because like I said, Harry Potter introduced me to the world of magic. Still waiting for my Hogwarts letter, and I would love to be put in a magical school. I also think that Juliet Marillier would do such a great job at creating the school and the setting. And also I have to insist on the friends to lovers trope. I love this trope so much, especially like childhood friends to lovers. This is like, I think, my favorite romance trope. And the next question is, what is a fantasy book that you've read this year that you want other people to read? And I found so many new favorites this year. This is going to be an impossible choice, but I did did decide to go with books that I think maybe are a little bit underrated still, and so the first one is going to be The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. I have just recently vlogged my experience with this book, and I love it so much. The character work in this book is perfect, so if you are a character-driven reader, then please pick this up. So this is an Asian-inspired story. Reads a little bit maybe like anime plot-wise, but not character-wise. I feel the characters are incredibly deep, and so we are following two characters, Mamoru, who is a 14-year-old boy, and his mother Misaki, as they navigate the reality of living in a very conservative country where women are not treated well, but are also just reduced to the roles of mothers and housewives, and are not expected to think for themselves. And also they are navigating the reality of war which comes to the place where they live. It's beautifully written, amazing characters. It's also a self-published fantasy, so please give it a try. And the second book that I have to talk about, and I feel like I've been talking about this book in all of my recommendation and kind of the best videos so far, but this is Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. I love this book so much. So this I would not recommend maybe as your first fantasy, because it's quite complex with the world. We get a lot of terminology and the magic systems are quite complex, but this is a beautiful story set in a Venetian-like setting, and we are following a con artist, Ren, who tries to con her way into one of the noble families in this world. However, while she's trying to do that, pretending to be a long estranged cousin, she also tries to navigate the politics of this world, the magic. There is a masked vigilante character, the Rook. So there is so much about this book that I loved. It's so intricate with the politics. There is also kind of like a murder mystery even aspect to this. So yeah, I would highly recommend both this and its sequel, The Liar's Knot. They are really amazing. Question number 4 is, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre, and what is one that you haven't read much from? And for me, my most read would be high fantasy. I love the feeling of being transported into the fantasy world. I love discovering new fantasy worlds, new magic systems. I am also so impressed how authors can create the whole new world in just their head and then on paper, with the culture and history and different peoples. It's absolutely incredible, and that's why I definitely love high fantasy. And maybe to add a bit more specific answer, I also this year discovered my love for what I call, and I think is being now called, sci fantasy. So this is a fantasy story which has elements of science fiction in it, or maybe it's a science fiction setting but there are elements of fantasy. And for me, books such as Red Rising by Pierce Brown, such as The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, I have been loving the blend of those two genres together, so it's definitely something that I've been loving recently. And as for the subgenre that I don't read often, I would say urban fantasy. I'm not really excited about reading fantasy books that are set in our world, especially adult fantasy. I like an occasional YA urban fantasy, like for instance Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. I really enjoyed this one, but for adult fantasy I really prefer the high fantasy setting. Question 5 is, who is one of your auto-buy fantasy authors? So I wouldn't say I have auto-buy authors, just because here in Poland, books in English are quite expensive, so I try not to buy that many. But I would say my auto want to read would be, first of all, Brandon Sanderson, who is the author of, for instance, The Final Empire. then I would love to read everything by Juliet Marillier, Robin Hobb, who is the author of The Assassin's Apprentice and the whole realm of the Elderlings. I would also probably read everything by Pierce Brown and Christopher Rocchio, who are those two sci-fantasy authors that I've also quite recently discovered. And then question 6 is, how do you typically find fantasy recommendations? And for me, the answer is very simple. It is through booktube. I find pretty much all of my recommendations on booktube, maybe some Goodreads articles, sometimes have books that I'm interested in, but booktube is such an amazing source. There are so many incredible creators here, and every single person has their own perspective and different books that they love, and I have so much appreciation for booktube creators, so this is where I get my fantasy recommendations from. Question 7 is upcoming fantasy release you're excited about. Book that I am pretty sure has not been released yet would be Fury Song by Rosaria Munda, which is the 3rd book in her Aurelian cycle, which starts with Fireborn. Question 8. What is one misconception about fantasy you would like to lay to rest? So the one that I encounter most often is that fantasy is for children, that fantasy is not mature reading, that there is no value for adult readers in fantasy. What I've seen is that quite often people who read fantasy, and that would be myself included, are looked down upon because it's not considered like a serious literature. Adult fantasy is a thing, it's a whole age group. There are so many incredible adult fantasy novels which are not for kids and they are not for young adults, and I think there are so many authors who tackle difficult, important themes in their work, social themes, political, environmental. There is so much being done in fantasy, and on top of everything that they do with kind of the commentary on the real world, is they also create a whole new world and a whole new magic system. So this is something that I absolutely admire, and there is so much to learn and to get from fantasy books. Question 9. If someone you know that doesn't read a lot of fantasy asks for a recommendation, what are the first 3 books that come to mind? And so the first book I would recommend is The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. I think this would work perfect not only for fantasy readers, but maybe for someone who wants to dip their toes just a little bit into fantasy, but still not be overwhelmed with a whole new world and a whole new magic system and all of that. This is a wonderful, cozy, beautiful story, but also including those elements that I talked about in the previous question, which is commentary on the society, commentary on what it means to be different and what it means to not be accepted because you are different, and if anything can be done with it. So there are some harder topics being discussed here. Still, I would say it brought me to tears, and those were tears of joy. I was so touched by this book. So in this we are following Linus, who is a middle-aged man, quite dissatisfied with his life, and he works as a caseworker where in his job he visits orphanages for magical children, and he takes a look at them, makes sure that the children are treated properly, and one day he receives this very difficult task of going to a faraway orphanage where some of the world's most dangerous magical children are held, including young Lucifer among others. And so he goes there, he investigates, he gets to meet all the children and also Arthur, who runs this particular orphanage. If you love love the found family trope, then definitely pick this one up. All of the children were so adorable and so unique. They all have very unique personalities, and they go on some trips and they get to know each other, and Linus gets to know each of the children separately and then all together, and it's one of my favorites. It's definitely one of my favorites. It helped me through a very hard time last year when I was going through quarantine and everything. So yeah, I would definitely recommend it for sure. And the second book that I would recommend, which I think is not the most original recommendation, however, we are talking about people who don't read fantasy but want to get into fantasy, so I cannot not recommend The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This book introduced me to adult fantasy. It's a nice bridge between young adult and adult, I think, with some of the characters being younger, but then the themes and the pacing are more adult. It's a good introduction to fantasy series, but also this book reads quite well as a standalone. The plot wraps up quite nicely, and then of course you will want to pick up books 2 and 3, but if you just want to get a glimpse of what adult fantasy is like, then this is your pick. In this we are of course following a group of people who want to overthrow an evil ruler. We have a interesting magic system known as allomancy, in which if you ingest metals you get special powers and abilities. So this is complex and political, with incredible world building and incredible magic system, and also Brandon Sanderson's writing style is quite easy to follow. I will say that I was a bit intimidated by adult fantasy, mostly because I thought the writing would be dense and then that I would not be able to follow the story, and in some cases this is the truth, but Brandon Sanderson's language is just so comfortable for me. I love reading his book. I love beautiful prose, and I wouldn't say his is particularly beautiful, but it's just very easy to read, and I'm never worried I will be lost reading his books. And yeah, that's why I think for someone who just plans to get into fantasy, that would be a great choice. And the last book that I would recommend is again something that I believe bridges young adult and adult a little bit. It is classified as young adult, and it is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. It is young adult, however, with the amount of character work and with how complex the characters are and how complex relationships between are, I believe this also might work for adult readers. So in this we are following a group of outcasts, a group of 6 people who go on an almost an impossible heist, and while the heist is exciting and I really enjoyed the plot in this one, it's the characters that shine. I think Leigh Bardugo did an excellent job with all of the 6 characters, both in the present timelines but also giving us their complex backstories, and there are so many layers to all of them, and I especially love the relationships between them. So when we begin the story, they are not necessarily friends, but as the story progresses, the trope of found family definitely becomes more prevalent. So I would definitely give this one a try if you have not read it yet. And the last question is, who is the most recent fantasy reading content creator that you want to shout out? And so I'm going to kind of combine this question with tagging some people, so please check the description box for a few really wonderful content creators who read fantasy and whose videos I have been really enjoying and appreciating lately. And yeah, that's all of the questions. Thank you so much, Ellie, for tagging me. I had so much fun with this tag. I hope you maybe found some interesting recommendations in this video, but in any case I would really appreciate it if you guys liked this video, if you enjoyed it, and subscribed to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next video very soon. Bye guys!